So here's what just happened. Canada didn't simply step back from one negotiation or pull out of a single trade agreement. No, what occurred was far more seismic than that. They withdrew from the entire structural framework that has governed bilateral commerce between our two nations for generations. Before Washington, D.C. even had its morning coffee, five formal withdrawal notices landed simultaneously on American desks. These weren't minor adjustments or negotiating postures. These were legal documents initiating the formal dismantling of what has been the most deeply interwoven bilateral economic relationship anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. USMCA, the cornerstone trade agreement, energy export arrangements that power American homes and industries, defense procurement partnerships that have kept our military supply chains integrated since the Cold War, agricultural cooperation frameworks that allow food to flow seamlessly across our shared border, and foreign investment protocols that have enabled capital to move freely between our economies for 70 years. Five foundational pillars, five simultaneous legal filings, each one beginning the administrative machinery of separating two economies that have been growing increasingly interdependent for 7 full decades. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, didn't stage a theatrical press conference filled with fiery rhetoric. He didn't issue ultimatums or threaten immediate retaliation. He didn't demand improved terms or better treatment. Instead, he released a written statement, 4 paragraphs, no inflammatory language, no emotional appeals, no dramatic adjectives, pure procedural language announcing that Canada had formally initiated withdrawal processes from its principal trade and economic agreements with the United States, effective immediately, with the legally mandated notice periods beginning to run from this very day. And then Trump erupted. But here's what nobody expected. This wasn't the typical volcanic, loud, aggressive eruption the world has grown accustomed to watching. This eruption was different in character, different in tone, different in what it revealed. White House aides described it using a word that has rarely, if ever, been associated with this administration's response to international pressure: panicked. Why panicked? Because for the very first time in this entire protracted trade conflict, there was nothing left to counteroffer. Think about the strategic dynamics here for just a moment. You can fight an opponent who wants something from you, who's trying to extract concessions, who's pushing for better terms. You cannot fight someone who wants absolutely nothing from you anymore. You cannot negotiate with someone who has already walked away from the table and closed the door behind them. Warren Buffett, when asked by a reporter to characterize what was happening, said something that cut to the bone. The true cost of any relationship only becomes visible at the moment it ends. And America, he suggested, was about to discover just how much of its economic infrastructure, its daily operations, its fundamental assumptions about how commerce functions was built on the bedrock assumption that Canada would simply always be there, always be willing, always be available. When you truly understand what those 5 withdrawal notices actually mean in practical terms, what specific economic activities they affect, how long the legal processes take to fully unwind, and critically, why they cannot simply be reversed with a phone call or a hastily negotiated replacement deal, you begin to grasp why this isn't a negotiating tactic. This isn't strategic posturing. This is an actual departure. And departures, unlike tariffs, which can be imposed and removed at will, don't come equipped with an off switch. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're witnessing is the most significant, most profound shift in North American economic relations in 70 years. Let me walk you through precisely how we arrived at this historic moment, because this wasn't an impulsive decision made in anger. This wasn't a snap reaction to a single insult or a particular tariff. This was the end result of a long, patient, increasingly painful process during which Canada systematically tried every other available option first. Over the past 18 months, Canada has attempted every diplomatic and economic approach available to a nation being systematically mistreated by a larger, more powerful partner. Every single approach, every possible avenue. It tried good faith negotiation. Carney personally sat at negotiating tables in Washington, approached discussions with genuine willingness to compromise, made real concessions on market access issues, proposed comprehensive frameworks that directly addressed American concerns about trade imbalances, and offered resource partnership arrangements that would have strengthened American supply chain security for decades into the future. The response from Washington? Personal insults directed at Canadian leadership and unilateral tariff escalation. Every single time Canada arrived at the negotiating table, prepared to work in good faith, the table got flipped over. Canada tried fact-checking the public record. Carney stood at podiums holding printed documents containing American data from American government agencies and systematically corrected 7 specific, demonstrable lies about Canadian trade practices, Canadian military contributions to joint defense, and Canadian economic dependency on the United States. Each correction was meticulously documented, independently sourced, and verified by third parties. The response? Accusations of fake news and continued repetition of the same falsehoods. The corrections were accurate, provable, and completely ignored. The lies continued, unchanged and unretracted. Canada tried patience as a strategy. It absorbed the 51st state rhetoric that reduced a 158-year-old parliamentary democracy to the status of an American territory. It absorbed the frozen wasteland characterizations that dismissed everything Canadians have built over generations. It absorbed the casual, repeated suggestions from the highest levels of American government that Canadian sovereignty itself is essentially fictional, that Canada exists only at America's pleasure. The response to this patience? Escalation. The insults didn't moderate, they intensified. Patience was interpreted not as diplomatic maturity, but as weakness, and that perceived weakness invited even greater contempt. Canada tried exposing hypocrisy in American policy. It revealed through investigative journalism and leaked documents that Trump's supposedly universal 100% tariffs on Canadian goods actually came with secret exemptions carefully carved out for his political donors. The fine print protected 14 specific companies that had made substantial financial contributions to gain access, while 330 million ordinary Americans ended up paying double for consumer goods. The response? 3 completely contradictory official explanations issued by different government departments within 48 hours, followed by a doubling down on threats against Canada. And then came the tweet that changed everything. 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night, a total comprehensive ban on all Canadian goods entering the United States, composed in the middle of the night, apparently prompted by a cable television segment about dairy trade that the president happened to be watching, issued without consulting a single member of his own government. The ban economically collapsed within 72 hours under the weight of its own impossibility. But the message it transmitted was permanent and irreversible. This is a country, Canada realized, that will attempt to upend its single most important trading relationship on an impulse at 2 in the morning because the president saw something on television that made him angry. That was the turning point. Not because the ban itself caused lasting economic damage, it was reversed before it could inflict real harm, but because it demonstrated with perfect, undeniable clarity that no amount of negotiation, no amount of fact-checking, no amount of patience, no amount of dignity, no amount of good faith engagement would fundamentally change the underlying dynamic. The relationship was not recoverable from within its existing framework, and so Canada made the choice that remained. We tried everything, Carney said in a private meeting with caucus members the week before the withdrawal notices were formally filed. According to multiple officials who were present in that room, he continued, Negotiation, presentation of facts, strategic patience, maintenance of dignity, public exposure of contradictions, legal challenges through dispute resolution mechanisms, trade diversification as economic leverage. None of it altered the fundamental reality that the United States views Canada as a subordinate entity, not as a partner. You cannot maintain a trade architecture with a country that treats you as a possession rather than an ally. At that point, you can only leave. Canada didn't snap under pressure. Canada made a calculated decision. And the difference between those two descriptions, snapping versus deciding, is the difference between something that can be walked back with apologies and phone calls and something that cannot be walked back at all. The 5 withdrawal notices hit Washington like 5 separate earthquakes, striking the same city on the same morning. The first withdrawal notice, and the most seismically significant, USMCA. Canada filed formal legal notification of its intent to withdraw from the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement under the provisions of Article 34.6. That article explicitly provides for any party to withdraw from the agreement with 6 months advance notice. Trump himself signed this particular agreement in 2020. He celebrated it repeatedly as his signature trade policy achievement, his replacement for NAFTA, proof of his negotiating superiority. And Canada just triggered the exit clause that Trump's own negotiators insisted be included in the text. USMCA governs approximately $1.3 trillion in annual trilateral trade flows. It establishes the governing rules for automotive manufacturing integration, agricultural commodity commerce, digital trade protocols, intellectual property protections, labor standards enforcement, and binding dispute resolution mechanisms between the 3 North American economies. Filing Article 34.6 withdrawal notification doesn't terminate these arrangements overnight. The 6-month notice period exists specifically to allow for economic transition, but it starts the clock running. And once that clock starts ticking, every business decision, every corporate investment plan, every supply chain calculation on both sides of the border must now be made under a cloud of fundamental uncertainty that did not exist the day before. The second withdrawal notice, energy. Canada announced a comprehensive review of all energy export commitments to the United States: crude oil, natural gas, electrical power, and uranium fuel for nuclear plants. Not an immediate cutoff, not a dramatic embargo that takes effect tomorrow, but formal legal notice that existing long-term supply arrangements are now under active governmental review and cannot be assumed by American energy planners to continue in their current form beyond the review period. The language is deliberately bureaucratic. The implications are existential for American energy security. Canada currently supplies 60% of all American crude oil imports, 98% of American pipeline natural gas imports, electricity for 6 American states whose grids are integrated with Canadian power generation, and uranium fuel for nuclear power plants that generate 20% of American electricity. Putting all of that under formal review doesn't turn off the taps tomorrow morning, but it sends an unmistakable message to every energy planning department, every utility company board, every refinery operations manager in America that the energy supply they have built their entire operational infrastructure around is no longer guaranteed beyond the review period. The third withdrawal notice, defense procurement. Canada formally suspended its participation in all joint U.S.-Canada defense procurement programs. The 2 nations have maintained integrated defense industrial cooperation continuously since the 1950s. Canadian aerospace companies building critical components for American weapons systems. American defense firms supplying platforms for Canadian military forces. Joint research and development projects spanning multiple decades with billions in sunk costs. Canada announced that all current joint programs would be immediately paused for comprehensive review and that all future Canadian military equipment purchases would be systematically redirected toward European suppliers, British manufacturers, and allied Asian defense contractors. The fourth withdrawal notice, Agricultural frameworks. Canada suspended all bilateral agricultural cooperation agreements covering grain inspection standards, food safety certification protocols, pesticide and agricultural chemical harmonization, animal health standards, and cross border livestock transportation regulatory frameworks. These technical agreements represent the invisible infrastructure of North American food trade. Suspending these frameworks doesn't stop food trade overnight, but it introduces friction at every point in the system. Inspections, certifications, and regulatory approvals that used to be automatic and instantaneous now require individual case by case processing. The fifth withdrawal notice, investment screening protocols. Canada announced that all American acquisitions of Canadian companies, natural resources, or real estate would immediately become subject to enhanced national security screening. The identical level of scrutiny previously reserved exclusively for investments originating from China, Russia, and other nations formerly deemed to be strategic competitors rather than allies. The message embedded in this policy change was unmistakable. The United States is no longer treated by Canada as a trusted economic partner. Warren Buffett was reached by phone that morning and asked a single question: "What does this mean?" His answer was devastating. "It means the bill has finally arrived." He paused deliberately. For 70 years, the United States has built its economic infrastructure on the foundational assumption that Canada would always be there, always be willing, always be available, that Canadian oil would always flow south through the pipeline networks we share, that Canadian electricity would always cross the border through the power transmission lines we connected decades ago, that the most integrated bilateral economic relationship anywhere in the world would continue functioning smoothly, regardless of how America chose to treat the partner on the other side of that relationship. He shook his head slowly. That assumption was never seriously tested before because it never needed to be tested. Canada was always there. Canada was always reliable. Canada has been the most dependable partner in the entire history of American economic relations. It always absorbed the insults, the arbitrary tariffs, the casual disrespect, and kept supplying energy, kept showing up at negotiations, kept doing its part of the partnership, while the other side took that reliability for granted until today. Trump's reaction confirmed everything Carney had calculated. White House sources described the president as shocked, disoriented, and unable to formulate a coherent response for over an hour. He reportedly asked aides repeatedly, "Can they actually do this? Can they legally leave?" The answer was unambiguous: yes. Any party can withdraw with 6 months advance notice. Canada had followed the procedure precisely as written. He had prepared his team for every possible Canadian response except the one that actually came. His advisors had war-gamed retaliatory tariffs, angry press conferences, diplomatic escalation, resource threats. They did not wargame Canada simply leaving, because in every scenario Washington had ever conducted, Canada was still at the table, still engaged, still wanting something from the United States that could be leveraged. Trump posted on social media within 2 hours, calling Canada ungrateful, foolish, guilty of the biggest mistake in trade history, threatening the biggest tariffs in the history of the world. But the threats rang hollow. Tariffs require an active trade relationship to function as a policy tool. If Canada is systematically redirecting its exports to Asian markets, European markets, and Indian markets, there's nothing left to impose tariffs on. You cannot tariff goods that aren't coming. For the first time in the entire trade conflict, Trump had no available play. Not because he was outmaneuvered tactically, but because the game itself was ending, and you cannot win a game that the other player has stopped playing. Congressional reaction was immediate and panicked. Republicans from border states demanded emergency meetings with the White House. The senator from Michigan called it the worst single day for American manufacturing since the 2008 financial crisis. Ford warned that USMCA withdrawal would trigger plant closures affecting over 25,000 direct jobs. Energy companies warned that crude oil supply disruptions could occur within 3 to 6 months. American refineries configured for Canadian heavy crude literally cannot replace it with domestic light crude. 6 months. That's how long Article 34.6 gives before withdrawal takes legal effect. 6 months to repair a relationship that has been systematically destroyed over 18 months by the very person who now needs to fix it. The math doesn't work, and everyone knows it. This isn't how anyone expected the US-Canada trade conflict to end. The world expected escalation, bigger tariffs, louder threats, more dramatic retaliations. What it got instead was the quietest and most devastating move of all. Canada stopped fighting and started leaving, stopped arguing about the terms and started walking away from the table entirely. Retaliation is loud. It gets attention. It makes headlines. Departure is quiet. It generates paperwork, legal filings, administrative procedures. It doesn't trend on social media. It is boring and procedural and devastating in a way that loud confrontations never are. Because loud confrontations end, people move on. But paperwork doesn't move on. Paperwork has legally mandated timelines. Paperwork has binding legal force. Paperwork continues advancing whether anyone is paying attention or not. 5 withdrawal notices, 5 foundational pillars of a 70-year economic partnership filed before breakfast on a Wednesday morning. Just the calm, administrative, procedurally correct language of a nation that tried negotiation and was met with lies, tried patience and was met with contempt, tried dignity and was met with insults, tried every available option within the existing relationship and concluded that the only remaining option was to exit the relationship itself. Canada didn't snap under pressure. Canada made a decision. And the difference between snapping and deciding is the difference between something that can be walked back with an apology and a phone call and something that cannot be walked back at all. Trump can threaten. Trump can rage. He can promise the biggest tariffs in history, but he cannot unfile a withdrawal notice. He cannot reverse a sovereign legal process that Canada initiated under its own constitutional authority. And he cannot negotiate with someone who has already decided that negotiation itself is no longer worth the cost of engaging. The most integrated bilateral economic relationship in the Western Hemisphere is being unwound. Not by force, not by crisis, not by war, by paperwork, by 5 legal notices filed on a quiet Wednesday morning by a government that tried everything else first and ran out of options that didn't involve walking toward the door. 5 notices, 5 pillars, 70 years of building, and a nation that looked at the country it had built toward for 7 decades and said, with the calm finality of someone who has made peace with the decision, "We're done.